California's $25 billion workers' compensation system is designed to help workers who are injured on the job. Unfortunately, some people try to cheat the system, with workers' comp fraud estimates running between $1 and $3 billion a year. Are we doing enough to fight workers' compensation fraud? We'll ask Elaine Howle, California State Auditor, whose office recently authored a report on that very issue.
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Workers' compensation has a noble purpose to provide a benefit to injured workers to help them get back on their feet. However, because of its size and complexity, the state's $25 billion workers' compensation system creates ample opportunity for fraud. Estimates are in the range of $1 to $3 billion a year. Recently, the Office of the State Auditor examined what can be done to better detect fraudulent claims. California State Auditor Elaine Howle is here to discuss the findings. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So, can you briefly describe workers' compensation? What is it? How does it work?
Sure. As you indicated in your opening, workers' compensation is a system in California that provides benefits to employees who may be either injured or disabled on the job, so that they can get the appropriate medical benefits, income payments while they may be disabled or away from work. But it's a system that employers pay into. They get insurance, and that prevents the employers or protects them a bit from being sued by the employees. So it gives the employees the benefit of medical services if they are injured, income while they're off the job, but also protects employers from being sued by those employees.
And it's a pretty big system. I mean, I was looking at your report, you cited 15.6 million employees are covered by the system, 936,000 employers are covered by the system, 607,000 accidents and injuries and illnesses a year. It's a pretty big system.
Very big system.
So the idea is it's a no-fault insurance system, funded by employers, to cover workplace injuries. It's the exclusive remedy for workplace injuries. So I assume then the employer's insurance rates are based on how many injuries there are in the workplace. And so more injuries result in higher premiums. So how much does this cost then in California employers?
Well, as you indicated, on a yearly basis, the system is about $25 billion. And you're right, an employer, depending upon the type of employment, so a roofer, for example, employing individuals going up on a roof, it's higher risk than someone working in an accounting pool. So there's a rating bureau that establishes the rates based on the type of work, but also the extent of the number of injuries that a particular employer may have with their employees.
And I'm sure that's kind of baked into so it's baked into the cost for roofing, for example. They put that into the cost of roofing.
Correct.
By the way, a bad idea to hire a roofer that's not covered by workers' compensation, because then you're going to be individually responsible if they get injured.
Right.
So state agencies, there's a number of state agencies that administer the workers' comp system. Briefly, who are they? What are they?
Sure. There's two primary agencies, Department of Industrial Relations, and that's the entity that's responsible for really managing workers' compensation claims. They also assist with some of the investigative work that's done. Department of Insurance, of course, is our state entity that licenses insurers, so they're making sure that insurers stay solvent, et cetera, and those insurers that cover workers' compensation or any type of insurance. But also the Department of Insurance has an important role in investigating potential fraudulent claims by employees, employers, providers, et cetera. So they do much of the investigative work. There's also work that's done at the local level by DAs. The primary state agencies, though, are the Department of Insurance and the Department of Industrial Relations.
You also said something about a rating bureau, which is a private entity that establishes pure premium rates. I guess those are the benchmarks that are based, that workers' compensation rates are based on. They're recommendations to the insurance commissioner.
That's correct. So this rating bureau, absolutely, as you indicated, we talked about just a few minutes ago, is depending on the type of employer and the number of claims that they may have, the number of injuries their employees have suffered, that affects the rates. And this rating bureau is basically a nonprofit, as you indicated, that determines what the rates will be for the different types of insurance for different types of employers.
Lots of players. Then we also have on the other side, we've got the insurance companies and the service providers. So what do insurance companies, what role do they play, and what role do service providers play in the process?
Well, certainly insurance companies are providing the insurance, the workers' compensation insurance for the employers, but they also have a role in trying to identify potential fraud, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit, about where they're required by state law to have some investigative units in their companies to try to identify potential fraud. The service providers are medical professionals, other types of providers assisting employees in filing claims for workers' compensation insurance.
That would include like rehabilitation services, those kinds of things?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So the focus on your report is workers' compensation fraud. How big a problem is it?
Workers' comp fraud is a significant problem in California. It's 1 to 3. The estimates out there are between $1 and $3 billion a year in fraudulent claims. So this is certainly an issue that the state needs to pay attention to and needs to do everything it can to try to prevent, first of all, but certainly detect and prosecute fraudulent claims of workers' compensation.
And I think in your report it says that 4 to 12% of the system's costs were fraud related, and then employers are likely to pass this on. You also indicate, it's talked about something called chargeable fraud.
Correct.
And I guess that's fraud that you can actually prosecute and win. And those numbers are, I think you said $970 million. These are ones we think we're going to win these claims. So pretty significant. And they also talked about the increase in workers' comp fraud. It's growing at a rate of 525%.
Well, that's specifically so what you're speaking about is chargeable fraud, and that's what local district attorneys feel very confident that they would get a conviction. The 525% increase is that chargeable fraud, but specifically for providers. That is the biggest area where we have seen an increase from, and we looked at a 3-year window. So from year 1 to year 3, it increased from about 130 million to over 800 million in chargeable fraud. So this is fraud local DAs feel very confident they can convict.
Wow, pretty interesting. So up next, we're going to talk about why is it so difficult to uncover workers' compensation fraud. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about combating fraud in the workers' compensation system. So what are the different types of fraud?
Sure, there's four primary types of fraud. The employee fraudulently claiming they are injured or they still need to stay off the job. Employers fraudulently not necessarily ensuring that their employees are getting the coverage they need.
Or saying that one person really is, a roofer is really on clerical staff and so they're going to get lower rates.
Right, misclassifying employees.
Then insurance companies?
Insurance companies, as far as issuing policies that they are not intending to support.
There's no there
provide
there.
Services, right.
Certificate of insurance, but really nothing there. And then service providers, which you're really concerned about.
Service providers is the biggest area of fraud that we've seen where there's a huge increase. And this is medical providers, attorneys, other individuals part of the process in assisting employees when they file a claim.
Yeah, billing for things maybe that aren't, services that aren't being conducted, being done.
Correct.
So you indicate the state has different ways to combat workers' compensation fraud, 4 different categories. One is prevention.
Right.
So the second is detection, the third is investigations, the fourth is prosecution. Any comments you want to make on those?
Sure. Prevention is trying to identify and provide outreach education to employees as far as their employer potentially fraudulently claiming they're a clerical person as opposed to a roofer. And then we're expecting the Department of Industrial Relations, our state agency, to really do some analytics, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, as far as doing analyses to try to identify potential fraud to hopefully prevent it in the future. Investigation is critically important. That should happen at the state level, but certainly at the local level by the DAs. And then prosecution, of course, is the DAs. And that's important to hold people accountable.
I actually mediated a case once, and I was telling the charging party, I explained to them that I thought there was potential of workers' compensation fraud. I explained it was a felony. His eyes got as wide as saucers. People don't know that you can get into a lot of trouble for filing a fraudulent claim.
That's correct.
Okay, so in your report, one of the problems you talk about in terms of detecting workers' comp fraud are this thing called referrals, or the lack of referrals.
Right.
What did you find?
So what state law requires is an insurance company to have what's called a special investigative unit. So any insurance company that is offering workers' compensation insurance needs to be doing these types of analytics, and then if they see something that is potentially fraud, they are required to refer that to the state of California through the Department of Insurance and to the local DA.
But there's a lot of them that aren't doing referrals.
Right. So what we did is we did an analysis of the top 21 insurers. So they have the highest volume of insurance premiums. They're providing insurance. And we looked at a 3-year window, and some of those insurers, the biggest, had referred 1, in many cases zero referrals.
I did the math on this when I was looking at your numbers. Almost 40% of 8 out of the 21 did not make referrals.
Exactly, and it's just not reasonable for one of the largest insurers to not see any kind of circumstance that looks like potential fraud. So we really raised a red flag there, not only with the insurance companies, but the Department of Insurance has a role in looking and auditing insurers. And so we said, are you doing this kind of analysis to see, well, you're a huge insurer in California. How could you have 0 referrals to
I would
us?
think the insurance company would want to ferret out the fraud, but apparently 40% is the number. Let's go on to data analytics. We talked about earlier. You think that's a really good way maybe to kind of help solve this problem. You found that the Department of Industrial Relations is not really using data analytics like it maybe should. What's the problem?
Right. I mean, clearly big data analysis is really important, can be a very powerful tool. And it's something that was identified years ago as a tool that industrial relations should be using as far as 2 aspects: detection, both looking back, and then predictive. So using the analysis that you've done of past fraudulent claims, looking to see, are there certain indicators here? Let's apply that to the current data we have to try to predict potential fraud.
Trends.
So the Department of Industrial Relations should be doing that and assisting the Department of Insurance in identifying, again, similar to what insurance companies should be doing, our state agencies should be collaborating to try to identify potential fraud and then hopefully investigate it and prosecute.
So dropping the ball maybe on both ends. Okay, the last thing you talk about here is this explanation of benefit statements to injured employees. Injured employees send a statement saying, here's what we took care of. You think giving that to employees is a good idea to kind of ferret out fraud?
Absolutely, and we saw the state of California does it for disability insurance. The National Medicare program uses an explanation of benefits. We think this could be an additional tool that the state could use. So if I'm an injured worker and I get that explanation of benefits and I see, well, my employer is being charged for an MRI. Well, I never had an MRI. Right. So it's another resource that the state could use. We think it's a very important tool to add to the toolbox for our state.
Another check. Well, up next, we're going to talk about investigating the investigations of workers' comp fraud. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Elaine Howle, California State Auditor, about a recent report her office did on ways the state can reduce workers' compensation fraud. One of the major shortcomings you found was the lack of investigators. How short-staffed are they?
Well, as of February, the Department of Insurance we're talking about, because they conduct these investigations, they had about a 27% vacancy rate. And we looked at about a 3-year window looking back to see how many staff are they losing. And they lost a significant number of employees to other state agencies, but it really weakened the ability for the Department of Insurance to do investigations. In fact, in many cases, they closed a referral. They didn't even investigate it because they didn't have the staff to do it.
I wanted to ask you about that. So if you're not investigating these complaints, there are people getting away with fraud.
That's absolutely true.
And what did your numbers find in terms of fraud? Were the numbers big?
The numbers were big as far as first of all, there were fewer referrals coming in, but the Department of Insurance was having to close more and more cases, more of those referrals, because they just had insufficient resources. I mean, you might have to help me with the specifics.
There was like $160 million on average, and the average referral that they weren't getting and prosecuting or investigating was $18,900. Then what I found was really interesting in your report was employee fraud. They're saying that subset would be $66.8 million in investigations they're not doing. That's an average of $9,800. This is big money.
It's big money.
And then what I found was really interesting was provider fraud, which you were talking about, service provider. There the numbers are a little smaller. It's only about 8% of the total, but their total is $48 million. The average is $71,800.
Right.
Per lost referral that's not being investigated.
Right, and that's where we think
they
absolutely big money, and they should target their efforts. If you're seeing such a huge increase in provider fraud, again, the DAs feel that it's chargeable, then let's focus our efforts there. But unfortunately, Department of Insurance, over the 3 years we looked at, they were closing about 28% of their cases because they didn't have resources. Over that 3-year window, that doubled to about 54% of their cases. So they need more investigators. So they need to do something to get more staff in their department to stay there.
It's almost a classic example of penny wise and pound foolish in a way, right? So why, if staffing's the issue, why don't the state just give the Department of Insurance just more money? Just give more money, hire more staff.
Well, and that was part of it. Part of it was they did an analysis, and we looked at their analysis where their investigators were making less money than investigators at Department of Justice, at Department of Corrections. That's where they lost a lot of their staff. But that's not the only thing that they need to do. We felt they needed to understand, why are some of those employees leaving? It's not just because of money. Is it because of job satisfaction? Some of the employees that left felt they didn't have the tools, resources, training to do their jobs and to do them well.
Now, one thing that you also talked about, maybe a better way to be more efficient with the limited resources the state has, is this thing called vertical prosecution.
Right.
What do you mean by that? How would it work?
Vertical prosecution is something that's been very successful in a lot of different investigative scenarios, but certainly in this, it's where an investigator is working very closely with the DA, the individual who's going to prosecute the case, so that when the investigator is collecting the evidence and doing the analysis, doing the actual investigation, he or she is collaborating with that DA to make sure I'm getting everything that you need to be able to successfully prosecute. Much more efficient.
Yeah, the left hand knows what the right hand is doing, right?
Right.
It's not duplication of effort. So, one of the things you flagged in your report was that the California Department of Insurance lacks a plan to recruit and retain investigators.
Right.
What are kind of the things you'd like to see? You talked about the money. They're paid quite a bit less.
Right.
As opposed to if you're an investigator for the Department of Justice or something, you're paid quite a bit more.
Right, and they did address the salary issue. They actually worked with our California Human Resources Agency that's responsible for salaries, and they did get a bump in their salaries. But we said, you need a retention plan. You need to understand why these employees are leaving above and beyond just money. And also broaden your recruiting. One of the things that they don't do, and that we think they should do, is recruit retired law enforcement, because they have the skill set to be able to assist in conducting investigations. And at a recent legislative hearing, I talked about, well, you want to bring in junior people coming out of school with a criminal justice major, but let's bring in some retired law enforcement to work with them and train
mentor
them, and then you have your succession plan in place.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about how do you solve the workers' comp fraud situation in California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So what are the things that can be done to reduce workers' comp fraud? Our guest is the state auditor, Elaine, Howle, has some recommendations in that regard. So one of the things you're concerned about, we talked about earlier, is this issue of referrals.
Right.
The California Department of Insurance does not currently screen for referral rates. So what would you like to see done?
A couple of things. We had two key recommendations related to this, and one of the graphics in our report really helped to depict what we think would be beneficial. So put a scorecard essentially up on the website. Here are the top 21 insurers in workers' compensation, and here are the number of referrals they've submitted to us, the Department of Insurance, in the last 3 years or 2 years or whatever time frame you select. Then you're really going to identify and put out there publicly, here are these insurers who are generating a significant amount of insurance premium, and they're profiting from that,
but the significance
they're not
of that,
referring.
Right, but the significance of that, if I'm an employer, is if I know my insurance company is not going after fraud, it means they're paying out on claims they shouldn't be, which means my rates are going to be higher.
Exactly.
So that puts some pressure on the insurance company to really be aggressive about
Right,
this.
because right now, as you indicated a few minutes ago when we were talking, insurance companies can just pass the cost on to the employer. The rates go up for the employers. So
Which
there really
pass
isn't a
along
lot
to the consumer.
To the consumer, absolutely.
Right.
So the other thing we suggested the Department of Insurance needs to do is to target some of those insurers for audit, to go in and say, you've only referred 3 claims in the last 2 years. We don't think that's reasonable based on the size of your premium.
And the low referral rate probably puts you on top of the scale in terms of priority of getting audited.
Right.
The other thing you're talking about was unspent funds, using that money to augment district attorney's offices as opposed to just giving the money back to employers in subsequent years. What are your thoughts there?
Right. So the thoughts there are there's a formula as far as 40% of the fraud assessment goes to the Department of Insurance to administer, 40% goes to DAs, and then there's 20% that's flexible. Typically that's been going to the DAs, but because of the number of vacancies that insurance has had in the past, they haven't spent all their money. Well, rather than give that money to the DAs to assist them in additional prosecution, they have basically reduced the rates in the future. But if you want to combat fraud, let's get that money to the DAs who have demonstrated that they could use more funding. So we need to see some changes in how the funding is provided at the state level and certainly at the local level.
Yeah, that 20% discretionary, you actually more to the DAs. Another thing your report recommends is that the Department of Industrial Relations use that data analytics we were talking about to identify service provider fraud. fine, but they've been talking about this for some time.
Right.
You have confidence they're going to actually get this done?
Right, and we're pressing them. Okay. I mean, and that's part of what the report and the recommendations is. You know, this is something that you identified several years ago. You're just starting to get rolling on this, but they really haven't developed a strong methodology, metrics, the types of things, methodology that they're going to use to create these analytics, both descriptive, as I talked about earlier, to identify past practices, but also predictive. So we really want to put the pressure on industrial relations to do a better job and get really moving on these analytics, because you've known it's a beneficial tool, and you should have had it in place long before
I'm
now.
guessing when the Chamber of Commerce or the National Federation of Independent Businesses sees your report and realize it's impacting their members, they're probably going to be knocking on someone's door and saying, you guys got to pick up the pace here.
Right.
Okay, you also talk about enlisting injured employees in the battle to combat workers' comp fraud by having them review these benefit statements for overcharges, things of that nature. Any proof that this is actually going to reduce workers' comp fraud?
Well, we looked at, as I said, disability insurance in California requires EOBs. The Medicare system submits EOBs, these explanation of benefits, to their individuals who receive Medicare. And it's been successful as far as individuals saying, yes, I look at that EOB as it's referred to, and I will report something that I think might be fraudulent because I have a duty to do so. The pushback we've received from the department and some of the insurers is, oh, it's going to be expensive to do. So we talked to some private sector, Disney. They send out EOBs. It costs them 50 cents per EOB. And what we're suggesting is do it periodically, perhaps on a quarterly basis. You don't have to send it out every single month or every single time an employee receives a benefit, but at least at some periodic time, and those employees, again, will serve as a tool to strengthen our enforcement and preventative measures with respect to fraud.
You know, it was interesting, just specifically, you looked at a 1998 report by the Office of Inspector General at Medicare, just to prove your, kind of reiterate your point. They found that 74% of Medicare beneficiaries said they would always read their EOB statements, and another 89% said that if they saw fraud, they'd report it.
They would report it, that's correct.
And so you're talking about, if cost is an issue, there's a way to reduce it by not doing it as frequently, and et cetera. And there's some examples in the private sector.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank the State Auditor, Elaine Howle, for joining us to talk about this important issue of workers' comp fraud. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on Facebook, Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.